The Stormbreak Expedition Open is in 1 week, and I am frustrated. Hello, everyone, and welcome to FECast episode 66, Expedition Open Looming. My name is Sunyveil. I'm one of your hosts. I'm joined by Expedition Throne Open top 8 competitor Stormblessed. Welcome back to the class. How's it going?
I'm doing. Go back to the class. I'm doing very well. I'm also frustrated at the format. Also, I believe you said Expedition Throne Open top 8, and I hope your premonition proves accurate at the very least.
Shoot, I meant Stormbreak Throne Open. Is that not what I said? By Friday, we're recording this on a Friday afternoon, but by Friday, I am just like, it's probably not the best time for me to say things that matter.
As we both stated, we're also frustrated at Expedition. I don't know what it is about this Expedition format, but it is just bananas. We'll be getting that eventually, as is sort of the overview of our FEcast for this week, is we're going to discuss the new, latest, exciting balance packs that Daryl has given us. Then, as always, we will discuss the TNE results. Third thing we'll discuss is the Expedition format and the upcoming Stormbreak Expedition Open that I'm sure all of you are excited about. And then finally, as always, we will discuss the dates to remember, and we will be discussing the tournament updates that Daryl has given us and the implications therein. So look forward to that at the end if you are interested. So let's start with the patch. So we got a number of nerfs and buffs, Sunny. So what do you think? We only got a couple nerfs and we got a number of buffs. Overall, before we get started, what do you think of the patch?
It is not enough. I mean, I think that there were things that needed to happen, and they didn't happen. I think we're just going to have a really bad Open next weekend, which is when the Expedition Open is, because they didn't hit the right things. And I'll elaborate more on that later. But I mean, I just think that this is a really ineffective patch, and I'm not thrilled with it for like trying to answer what it's trying to address.
Yeah, so I guess to kick things off, we'll start with they only had 2 nerfs this time. So they nerfed, and a lot of people say they nerf around Golem, and to an extent that feels sort of accurate, but it also feels, sometimes like they've said they don't nerf around Golem. This time it kind of does feel like a nerf around Golem, and also around other cards like, say, a Felrock, for instance. But they nerfed Ikaria. First Reaper Ikaria was a 6-cost 5/5 that cost 6 Shadow and summon, destroy an enemy unit or site, and then you also got to, if it dies, they lose all the spells in their hand. Now it's a 7-cost for the same stats and same effect. So, kind of unplayable, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it makes its way into Expedition. I know it's not in the format now, but if it is in Expedition and there is a mono shadow deck, yeah, maybe it's playable. But I mean, Ikaria was not the problem. This obviously has to do with the dominance that even Feln had in the last Throne Open. And Ikaria, like, I'm not convinced that Ikaria was even the best 6-drop for that deck. I think that maybe it might be better just to have the Speaking Circle as the 6-drop of choice. I don't know. I guess maybe Ikaria is a little better than the Speaking Circle, but that was not the problem with the deck, and I think that's a sentiment that is echoed by a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, Ikaria was sort of like a very solid finisher, especially in a mid-range metagame, which, we were in an exceptionally mid-range metagame, and that's where, Ikaria shines, right? The thing is that, we can also shift out of mid-range metagames, and Ikaria will suddenly become less effective, and, the thing is that Felrock will always be great. And as Sunny sort of alluded to, whether or not Ikaria was the best finisher in the deck, right, there's still other good 6-cost finishers, right? You can just replace Ikaria with Speaking Circle, and the deck probably will be just about as strong. Maybe it'll be a little weaker, maybe it won't be. You can play just a different 6-cost card, or, play like Honor of Claws or something in the spot, right? There's other cards you can play that also will help you end the game and close out the game. And Ikaria, while being an extremely efficient card in a very specific metagame, Felrock's going to always just be a very gross card, and there's just other cards that exist too.
Yeah, I mean, you could have your plan for finishing the game be getting a Kostvar out of the market or something, for example. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, this nerf doesn't do anything. It changes a card that a deck plays, but that's it. All right, the other change is a lot bigger, and I think one that I think a lot of people are pretty happy about. Maveloff Huntress, which was the most played card in day 2 of the Throne Open is now a 3-cost 3/1 instead of a 2-cost 2/1. It still has double primal influence. That means that the even decks can no longer play Maveloth Huntress, but also decks like Kira or Elysian that were really relying on Huntress we'll have to think twice about just jamming 4. And the more I think about this, the more I like this change. I didn't think Huntress was a problem before, but as I started to think about it, I was like, yeah, maybe it really was.
Yeah, we had a long discussion last week on the cast with Boxer, right? Where we discussed a bunch of potential nerfed cards, and the last one we discussed was Maveloth Huntress, and I think we sort of all came to the conclusion that it probably was too good, but maybe wasn't. After the nerf, I'm definitely kind of leaning towards it probably was just too good. I think the nerf probably is a very good change. Because the difference between a card like Maveloth Huntress being the most played card in the format and a card like Torch being the most played card in the format is that Maveloth Huntress being a unit in some ways leads to more repetitive gameplay because you just see it more often on the board, right? It's doing things every turn. Whereas a card like Torch gets played, it's in the void, it's gone. So you just don't see it as much. So it's just less omnipresent on the battlefield in the games. It also, has less swings, right? M. Gallup called Maveloth Huntress a 2-cost predatory Carnosaur. And, while that wasn't completely accurate, it also wasn't inaccurate either, right? Like, it was a very absurd card, especially with cards like Dovid, right? Making Maveloth Huntress less of a tempo play, right? Because Maveloth Huntress still could be a very powerful card, still can do its stuff. It's interesting that the card is better at base value in many ways than before, right? A 2-cost deal 2 plunder is a lot worse than I think than a 3-cost deal 3 plunder just because of how damage thresholds work. So I think the base card on Huntress is better. So I like that aspect of it where you don't have to imbue it quite as much for it to be as good. But I think knocking down its tempo value, it keeps the spirit of the card intact, as they like to say. When changing cards, we want to preserve what makes them play well. And so the Huntress having its stat line, being able to play without having to imbue is what makes it play well. And so bumping it up in cost, I think, was a really good change there. So rest of the patch I'm unsure about, but this nerf, I think, was excellent.
Yeah, it puts Huntress in line with the other unconditional removal, like Slay, for example, is a 3-cost card. So yeah, I think that we're just happy to see this change. But I'm overall really unhappy with the patch because of what is missing from it. And we'll talk about that a bit when we start talking about Expedition. So in addition to these 2 nerfs, we have a number of buffs. So the first buff we have is Borderlands Lookout is now a 0/3 from a 0/2. This is interesting because this has undergone many different changes over the years. So Borderlands Lookout is the 1-cost 0/3, now a 0/3 Elf Explorer, +1 for each type of influence the enemy player has. So if you're against a 2-faction deck, usually this is going to be a 1-cost 2/3 that silences down to a 0/3. If you're against the 3-faction deck, could be a 1-cost 3/3, and I mean that's pretty big. Borderlands Lookout has always been pretty good. It's made its way into some constructed decks. Do you think this puts it over the hump for like time-based aggro decks and Throne?
If those decks exist, I think it kind of does, right? As a 0/2, it wasn't very good because it didn't have another effect, right? Like we've seen, if you like 2/1s that like Pyro Knight, has another effect, right? Kazuo has another effect, but just a blank 1-cost 2/2. If Fresh Recruit, the 1-cost 2/1 was a 1-cost 2/2, I don't think the card would be like that much more playable. That being said, a 1-cost 2/3, if we just assume this card in most games, the 1-cost 2/3, which I think is relatively valid assumption to make, I think that line might be good enough, right? It mirrors the old Lookout. The old Lookout was a 1-cost 0/1 that got +1/+1 for each type of influence. So in a versus a 2-faction deck, it's the same card it was originally. So the real question is the original card good in right now in a format? And the answer is I don't know if there's a deck for it, but I think the card probably is somewhat playable in Throne if at the moment won't see any play currently.
Yeah. The other thing is that like 3-faction decks aren't very popular just because of how incredible insignias are.
Yeah.
And how incredible like payoffs for going deep in a faction are.
I mean, you say that, but currently one of I'd say the 2 best decks in Throne right now is a 3-faction deck. So
yeah, but it's also like a 3-faction deck that's less likely to care about as a 3/3 on the ground.
Yes, that's very true. So
yeah.
Anyways, the next buff is Rolling Spike back, the 3-time Primal, Aegis Reckless, Summon, Create and Draw a Random Dinosaur, was a 3/1, now it's a 3/2. It does make the card a lot better. Can't be just traded in by a Grenahen or just a regular Grenahen token, but it's still kind of an irrelevant card, so I'm okay with moving on if you don't have anything else to say about it.
Yeah, I don't have anything to say about this. Cool buff. Let's move on. So the next buff is Forgemark Scrivener. Is now a 2-cost 2/3. It was a 3-cost 2/3. This is the Oni that has Mastery 2, play a weapon on one of your other Oni. And Mastery 6 is you play a weapon on each of your other Oni. So this is huge. I mean, when you're talking about a card that has Mastery and its cost is being reduced, you get it one turn earlier and you're much more likely to be able to achieve that Mastery. So this is a really big buff. Now, the base card was pretty bad to begin with. Do you think this pushes this into the realm of throne playability, Stormblessed?
If you think that means Onis are going to become tier 1, probably not. But I think that this does become throne playable. As I always like to put it, I like considering threshold and consistency in my decks, and I think giving Onis another solid 2-drop, especially one that can feel out weapon synergies. If you can get Mastery, it's sort of like a 2-cost 3/4 that splits its stats, which is, pretty good. So I think it's going to be a solid card in Onis. Onis is probably a solid tier 3, tier 2.5, maybe tier 2 deck, but I'm glad it got buffed. But I think it's a lot better than the Rolling Spike back buff. But, for what it's trying to do, I think it's a good buff for what its intended purpose is.
Yeah, I mean, like, Onis is kind of interesting because you've got some really good cards in it and some real stinkers. So,
Yeah.
like, I'd have to look at exactly what the 2-drops that this is now competing with and to see if, like, 2-drops was the weak point in the deck. I think 1-drops is actually, like, a problem because you only have one unit that you really are super happy about playing on turn 1. I don't know. Actually, Akko and Oni Ronin are both pretty good. I don't know what the weaknesses of the deck is. Maybe if it's not 2-drops, then the deck is that doesn't help the deck. But like, yeah, this is definitely a lot more interesting now. It strikes me as being kind of similar to Black Hole War Leader.
Black Hole Warrior looks a bit better overall, but this has a bunch of synergy Black Hole Warrior does not, right? It has the weapon synergy, it has the Oni synergy. Okay, the next buff is the most impactful buff, I think, out of these sets, potentially, is Power Cell. Power Cell was a 2-cost 2/1 for Fire Time with Decay. When you play another Sentinel, it gets a +1 attack boost. And Summon, create and draw a Power Burst. And Power Burst was a 0-cost spell that gives you an extra power once. The card's a lot better now. It trades a lot better. It doesn't just die to anything, a Soft Breeze, a Condemn, a 1/1, or a Grenahen, for instance, which is a big deal. Can now, trade effectively into Grenahen, either if you play another Sentinel, it becomes a 3-power, or just shrink the Grenahen, so the Grenahen, is now neutralized even further. And Power Cell, putting extra card in your hand, again, very good. Either you get a solid tempo play, getting that extra 1 power can, be a huge swing depending on what you need to do in your turn. And aside from that, it can be discarded to Craft the Occultist or plundered away into actual power. So, solid card.
Yeah, I think Power Cell is really good. I think this card is excellent, but I don't think the cards around it or the strategy surrounding it is nearly good enough. But like, this went from being a card that I already thought was pretty good, and now the fact that it can attack through 1/1s without feeling terrible, that's huge. I mean, if you're playing a deck that has multiple Sentinels, this could be a 4/2 Decay, which attacks well into a lot of things. So yeah, I mean, great card. We need the support for this to be a real deck.
I think my one problem with the buff side of this, and I guess we'll get back to this sooner when we talk about the nerfs or whatever, is I don't think there was enough cards buffed. I would have liked to see more buffs in general. Even if it's like irrelevant buffs like Rolling Spike back or more Power Cell buffs, I just think that there wasn't like enough of the patch. I would have liked to see a bigger patch.
Yeah, I'm sure you could just like, take a poll of the Eternal player base and be like, what are your favorite cards? And then the ones that aren't like current tournament performers, you could just look at them and be like, oh yeah, this could get, an extra point of health, or, have Plunder stapled onto it or something, or like have Valkyrie Warp stapled onto it.
If they were to do taking a poll of like, everyone's favorite Eternal cards or whatever, would, probably be some good, survey data if they can get enough, survey information, right?
Yeah. Okay, so with the change to Maveloff Huntress, Throne looks reasonably different, although the main players are still there. We had TNE just finished up a few hours ago. It was won, to no one's surprise, by Doc28 on FPS Trove, so congratulations to Doc for their victory in this TNE and their top 16 towards Worlds that they haven't lost yet. as I like to call it. I'm not surprised. Doc was probably one of the best players in the tournament, if not the best player, and her deck list looked well tuned for FPS, so no surprise seeing them take it down.
Yeah, I mean, Doc, she played a deck that she knows well, that she knows is good. She's just upping her game every time, right? It's always impressive to see Doc play because she just performs well.
Rounding out the top 8, we had a total of 3 Trove players, 3 FPS Trove players, 2 Hirukira, 1 Skycrag aggro. Congratulations to longtime patron of the show, by the way, Chrissier, for their top 4 finish with Skycrag. 1 factionless shadow deck piloted by Roshi. Who knows what's... Anytime Roshi makes the top whatever of a tournament, you always wonder, like, how they got to their deck. And I mean that with, like, the greatest of respect, because... being a brewer and always taking brews to tournaments and doing well with them is really impressive. And finally, 1 even film deck, rounding out the top 8. So, I mean, I said that I didn't think Trove was the real deal after the last tournament, and this tournament is making me look bad when I said that.
Yeah, I mean, it's making me look good, so I'm okay with that.
In actuality, I think that the Trove decks are getting more and more tuned, which is a big deal, and the one that won the tournament certainly did really well. You also have to keep in mind that Trove was basically a quarter of the field going into the tournament, so to see 3 Trove in the top 8 is not particularly surprising.
I mean, it was a quarter of the field in the top 64 as well.
Yeah, and then it didn't make any in the top 16.
It made 1.
Oh, sorry. Two in the top 16, none in the top 8. Anyway, we've been over this. We will get another data point on Tuesday when the next Throne Tuesday Night Eternal happens. All right, let's talk about Expedition, because that is the big deal. That's the big tournament coming up. Someone's going to qualify for Worlds next week. I guess we can talk about the format first and then talk about why I'm so frustrated with the format.
Well, actually, I should say multiple might qualify for Worlds next week, right? You could have, if we any repeat top 4 people, they immediately qualify for Worlds too.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. So who are the players in the top 4? It's Kolokoma, Netscape Navigator, and who played Sling?
It was Cinemod.
So we are going to be watching carefully if Kolokoma or Cinemod or Netscape Navigator can repeat a top 4.
It's really funny to look at the curves, though, because the curve is basically for the other 3, because they're all playing even decks. Not only is it all even, but it's basically just like a line of 2 drops, right? Because it's basically all 2 drops with like a couple 4s and a couple 6s. And then for Cinemod, it's not a curve; it's just a wall. So that's pretty funny. But yeah, so. We'll see if any of those 3 make top 4 again. They immediately get to Worlds. Aside from that, there's another, if any of them make top 16 or the other 8 people in the top 16, including yours truly, repeat their performance, then any of those players get to go to the last chance tournament.
Yes, indeed. All right, let's talk about Expedition, shall we? That's how we got on this topic anyway. Okay, so we've had 2 tournaments in Expedition since the set dropped. But admittedly, I don't think it's a stretch to say that the decks that were played for those tournaments were pretty experimental and not very tuned. So what does the Expedition format look like going into this week?
The Expedition format doesn't look at all. It doesn't look like anything. It's such a wide open format right now. Like, so many decks seem like reasonable choices or reasonable options for further tuning. Just a very wide open format. If you've played any ladder, we'll get to more discussions on ladder in a little bit, but if you play any ladder, you'll know that there's just a wide variety in options right now. I don't know what's spurring this extreme variation that people are seeing or are feeling about the format, but it is there.
Well, I think what's going on is that there aren't really well-tuned decks to push people out of the metagame yet, so like you can kind of succeed with anything. But like I think once we start seeing a lot more people pick up a really well-tuned version of several decks, then we'll start weeding out strategies that perhaps are not quite as solid for this tournament.
The thing is that right now, the thing is that since everything feels untuned and it feels like anything can win, at the same time, and the frustrating part is it feels like anything can lose, and it feels like nothing is good enough. And I think part of that is they said that things aren't tuned, but the thing is is I don't know if things will get tuned by the tournament starting, because we've now had multiple weeks of Expedition being the primary focus for metagame tuning, and nothing has coalesced at all except for a couple ideas, and we'll get to that in a second. But even then, out of those ideas, there's still a birth of options even in them. So I don't know if things will get tuned by the Open.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I think we're going to see a lot of changes to these decks, and decks are going to look a lot different, even into like Wednesday of next week. By the way, we're recording this on the Friday before the tournament, so 7 days before day one of the tournament. Anyway, let's talk about the decks that we can be fairly confident are going to show up in some form and in with some representation, because they are the two decks that won Tuesday Night Eternal tournaments in Expedition. We talked about these last time, but to reiterate, there's the Overloader deck that uses Amplify and Overloader in order to make lots of power and play Pyrotech Explosion on the opponent and just kill them with like dealing hundreds of damage. And the other one is soldiers, Hooru soldiers, that uses Terra in order to make very large units quickly. And I think what both of these do is that they really put a clock on the format. You can't really expect to live past 7 against either of these decks. And sometimes through like a fair amount of disruption too. These are the two decks that I've been playing the most. I've played a fair amount of soldiers, and I think it's a good aggro deck, but I don't think it's unbeatable by any means. And I've been playing a lot of the Overloader deck, and boy, does it feel really good. I just feel like there's a lot of play to the deck. I feel like it sees a ton of cards, and then it just kills people with 7 power and Overloader and Diabolic Machinations.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the concept I always like to call, I'd say it's the pillars of the format, right? And there's sort of two main ways to look at pillars of the format. There's sort of the foundations for that everything has to be based on, which in Suny's case, referring to the idea of they set a clock on the format, right? They dictate the pace of the game. You have to be able to interact with one or both, and you have to be able to put something on the board soon enough. The other way I like to look at pillars of the format is in popularity. I think that's in some ways more useful, especially going into the Open, right? In the previous Throne Open, I said like even Felon would be really popular. Kira would be very popular. If you were taking a deck, you knew that it had to have a good game into one of these two. And that sort of applies here too, right? If you're taking a deck, you want it to be able to beat one of these decks or both. Of course, I think there's some trickiness here. In one, I think the metagame is very wide open, at least currently, so I don't know how popular anything will be. And then two, specifically about Overloader. Now, soldiers I expect we'll see plenty of. I think soldiers is probably the best thing to call the first pillar of the format, because I think that is likeliest to have the most share of the metagame on day one, maybe even day two, depending. But Overloader, while it might have a good conversion from day one to day two, it might not. I don't know. The deck it's a combo deck, so there's always questionableness there. The real problem with it is that I don't know how popular it's going to be, because while it has powerful moves and can be a very powerful deck, it's also very tricky to play, and it's a deck that Eternal hasn't had in a while, if ever, so it's unfamiliar to a lot of people. As we've seen in previous formats in Throne, the best example is Elysian in Throne. For months and months and months and months, Elysian in Throne was the single best deck, I would say. I think it would probably put it at the top deck, with Kira as sort of, maybe it's equal, but I'd probably still put Elysian as higher than Kira. The thing is, though, is that for as powerful as the deck was, you'd rarely see it on ladder. I mean, like, you would see it on ladder, but like it wasn't that popular on ladder. And if there was a Throne term, I don't think it would have been that popular either. And the reason is that it's a really hard deck to play. If you're playing incorrectly, you probably will just lose, because the deck is very hard to play. And Overloader, I think, kind of fits that bill a little bit somewhere. At least that's my theory right now, is that while it's extremely powerful, I'm not sure about how popular it'll be because of its skill level or its difference in skill required, you could say.
Yeah, that's fair. It is very difficult to play. Like, there are some times where you just have the combo. You have Overloader plus Hardiness plus Diabolic Machinations on turn 5, and you just kill them. But there are also parts where you have to play around certain cards, and there are parts where like you only have a few pieces of the combo, and you have to figure out how to assemble the rest of it.
And if you miss sequence, you die, because It's a combo deck, and you don't have the time to miss sequence, because if you let your opponent hit you an extra turn for 5 or 7, you just die. If you don't put the right things on the board, if you don't, play your cards in the correct order, you will just die. That is just how the deck works.
Yeah, unlike most other combo decks, like, for example, Reanimator, it doesn't really matter what your life total is going off when you go off with Reanimator. But with this deck, it matters. Every extra point of life you take is 2 power that you're not going to have on your combo turn. That's a big deal. Anyway, so look, I have never registered a combo deck for a Eternal, like a big Eternal tournament. I am considering registering this. Like, it's looking very likely that this is what I'm going to be taking, because I just feel like the tools to fight it are not fantastic. There's a few there, but this deck, it has negates of its own. It has disruption of its own. It has redundancy. I was in a game where I machinations for a bunch of life or whatever. And my opponent had the negate, but I also had a align the stars in my hand. So I had enough power from just doing the machinations that I could go get whatever I needed to go and kill them anyway. Like, even through a negate, it wasn't the fact that the spell was resolving. It was the fact that I was getting the power off of it.
That's one of the weird ways about how Overloader and also, again, like Maveloft Lead and other cards like it work, is that you don't need your spell to resolve for the Amplify to go off. And that also in some ways makes the deck more resilient, because if you don't need your card to resolve to allow you to combo off and finish, then, that means that negates are also still as good, right? You can't kill Overloader in response. And that's, if you play Machinations as the final card, because you still get the power no matter what. Before we move on Overloader, I just want to tell one funny story about the deck. I played a game where I tricked my opponent into not countering my Machinations, and I had no other cards. If they'd countered Machinations, I would have lost the game on the spot. So I knew they had Dazzle, and I played Overloader. My hand was power Machinations. And I knew that they have no burn in the deck, right? They're like a tradition deck. Or they may have been a Hooru control. I know. They had Justice. I know that much. And so I play Machinations for just half my life total, because I'm like, they're going to think that I have another Machinations in hand. I need the extra life total for the second Machinations. And so they didn't counter my Machinations, and then I got what I needed to when I won the game. And that was just like, I tricked them, and it felt great.
With the build that I'm playing, you don't need to Machinations for much to be reasonably confident that you're going to kill your opponent. By the way, the version that I'm playing, it'll be linked in the description of this. I made a change, and we've been having this discussion in Discord. I made the change to have the 4 Overloader in the main deck rather than just having the 1 in the market. You can go ahead and read the walls of text of discussion about this. But I mean, basically what it came down to is I don't want to be playing the Fire Merchant for like 1 or 2 cards in my market. With the addition of Grenahen and Crafty Occultist, I feel like you can see enough cards that if you just have 4 of the card in your deck, you're pretty reasonably likely to see it in the game. And it also means that you're not weak to just your 1 Overloader dying or being stripped from your hand with an exploit. Like, that was a way to beat previous versions of the deck, and that's not the case anymore. You can get Rain of Frogs, but like, you have to get Rain of Frogs and not have Dazzle or Condemn up, because you have ways of combating that. So
I'm just going to say a counterpoint here, because I still kind of think that it might be extended versions better, just because I'm a fan of consistency. And the thing is like, you have different vulnerabilities is the thing here. It's not just that you're better in one way or better in the other way, right? As I said, you can play Rain of Frogs, but also the same way, if you're saying that, you can fight Rain of Frogs, you can also fight Exploit the exact same way you can fight Rain of Frogs, right? Like, the same cards that deal with Rain of Frogs also deal with Exploit. So it's not like that's, one-to-one, like, oh, it's an easy advantage. It's like, it's very tricky. I feel like the best thing to do, obviously, be to put a ton of man hours into doing a bunch of math. But I don't think anyone's going to do the requisite math to actually truly understand what's the best thing here.
Yeah, there was a lot of math going on in the Discord about like whether Grenahen, what the actual percentage of Grenahen hitting in this deck is, and the ultimate answer is it doesn't matter, because Grenahen gets you 3 cards closer to the ones that you actually need, or like the ones that you don't have very many copies of. So
yeah, so the real math you should be doing, rather than like Grenahen hits, which I do think is also still valid for a number of reasons, but I'm not gonna go too heavily into that. The real answer is that you need to look at, if you were kind of looking at this deck, is you need to look at the odds. You find Overloader basically on either scenario, right? Because I do think that there is a sort of power level increase that you gain, and I think this is the real advantage. Is regardless of anything else, is the power level increase from having Overloader main deck compared to the market. I think market will always be more consistent. That's just a fact, right? Regardless, because you can also play Grenahen and it will, Grenahen hits Overloader, right? That's 4 copies in your deck. But Grenahen can also hit Condemn and Merchant, so that's 8 hits in your deck. So it's always going to be more consistent to have Overloader in the market. But there is a power level increase having in the main deck, right? You can keep Condemn for interaction. You can, you don't have to go grab the Overloader, right? With Condemn, it's kind of easy because you do it end of turn, but with Merchant, you have to make specific sequencing moves in order to grab Overloader. So there's less flexibility in gameplay from playing it in the market. So the real question is the consistency enough with Grenahen main deck? And the answer is, I haven't done the math, so it's based on feeling, and that's basically the best we're gonna have to go for.
Yeah. In any case, yeah. Overloader combo, very strong. I went 17-3 with it yesterday, although I played some games today and now my win rate is going back to normal. But that definitely had a lot more to do with people's decks on ladder definitely not being prepared for it, which is not something I can expect for the tournament next week.
Let's discuss the idea that currently, I think right now, ladder is, a lot of people say that ladder doesn't matter, and I think those people are silly. I think ladder has a number of good ways that it has a bunch of benefits, and I think it is very useful a lot of the time. Right now, though, Expedition Ladder is just super silly. It's just like, you could just play the oddest of oddball decks. You can play just the widest of variety of decks. There's just so much randomness on ladder, and so many, I don't want to say, there's so many like mediocre decks that like do reasonably well because anything can win right now and anything can lose. So ladder is in an odd place, so it's hard to use it as evidence of anything currently, at least in my experience.
Yeah, this is the least helpful ladder has been for any tournament preparation I can remember. I ran into, not that these two aren't necessarily linked, but I ran into Dark Revenger playing Svetya Replication Cell.
Yeah.
So they just made a Svetya every turn. And I was playing Overloader. I couldn't beat it. Well, I guess like it wouldn't have been impossible if I could Display of Menace the Replication Cell. But in any case, like, is that a real tech? Man, I guess it's possible, but that's a lot to lean on. Anyway, let's talk about some of the other decks that might be in Expedition this next weekend. What's on your short list for decks that you might see next weekend?
What? Wait, next you might see or next I might play? Because I guess they're both the same question.
See. I mean, like, we've already talked about decks that we think are good, but we just don't have enough information about anything else to say anything, right?
I think we will see Schrodinger's decks. I think the decks are in a quantum superposition that can only be determined once they're identified. I've considered Overloader, Soldiers, Combre, Tradition, FPS not Overloader, like a control deck. I've considered Skycrag midrange. I have considered anything with Speaking Circle. I've considered 4 and 5 faction sling decks. I've just considered draft cards. Recently I've been playing a bunch of draft cards on ladder, and it is a blast. Just which I'm calling Sentinels, by the way, because Sentinels you're playing like Laser Blast and Controlled Demolition and Bastion Gatekeeper and Auto Tread, and you've got a bunch of, draft cards. Like, I've considered taking a draft pile to Expedition, basically. Just so many random decks, just so much nonsense out there, and in both good and bad ways. When I say nonsense, I don't just mean that as a pure negative or a pure positive.
So here's what I'm thinking. I tried playing some Combre, and it felt like the entire time I was just waiting to lose. Like, that's what playing the deck felt like.
That one, I think I've basically ruled out Combre out of the entire list. Like, I want Combre to still be good because Combre was my first love for this Expedition format. When the Expedition format first started, I just jammed Combre forever, and it was just incredibly fun to play, like, Builder's Decree for 9. But as the meta went on, I guess Dovid was released, and Machinations combo became more of a thing. Those two things kind of pushed Combre out the window. Decks did get more tuned, right? Combre was an easy deck to build compared to anything else. Even like Mandrakes were harder to build than Combre was.
Yeah.
So yeah, Combre is pretty much out at this point. But the rest of the decks that I listed are all decks that I've actually considered.
I also feel like Hooru Control has a similar problem. Basically, it comes down to this. if you're playing Expedition, you have to deal with a really strong Overloader deck that's threatening to kill you on turn 5, and a really strong Soldiers deck that's trying to kill you on turn 5. And the way that they kill you is like completely different. Like, how do you defend against both at once and have a reasonable shot?
Yeah.
Either you have to do something extremely proactive, or you have to have the complete right concoction of answers and hope that whatever unknowns that you didn't account for don't make their way into your tournament path. So, like, I think that's really tough.
Yeah, I have the same feeling. That's why I think control decks are hard right now, especially because there's just so many different variety of decks out there. The open format makes control harder. Again, that's why I'm looking at FPS as a control deck, is that you basically get Display of Menace. And I think Display of Menace, Grenahens, whatever, Crafty, those sorts of cards allow you to fight on a variety of axes. Because Display of Menace, again, being a flexible card, it allows you to draw into your other cards. It allows you to draw into your negates, market access, try to deal with machinations of your exploits. And it also allows you to deal 1 to a bunch of things, which can be decent versus soldiers, not necessarily, but they do play a bunch of X1s. And then finally, you can kill a Relic, which kills Sling, or Hooru Control plays Relic sometimes, and Combray plays Relic. So just the flexibility of Display of Menace in this current metagame is why I think if you're going to play some sort of control deck, I think it has to have Fire, Primal, and Shadow in it. But I don't know if that's good enough.
Yeah. Make use of Grenahan and Crafty Occultist. Those are good cards, I hear. Anyway, so this is like my frustration with the format. I mentioned it earlier. Yes, you do not have Huntress anymore. You don't have to worry about Dovid into 2-cost Huntress, but Dovid into 3-cost Huntress is still very good. Dovid is still an incredible card. It's unreal how good Dovid is. A 4/4 that draws you a card for just 2 power. And on the other side of things, they didn't touch the Overloader combo. And I mean, I feel like between these two effects, there's just such a strain on the format. I couldn't believe that Dovid was not nerfed. And after seeing what Overloader can do firsthand, I also can't really believe that Overloader is still untouched. And I think it's just so hard to fight against both. And I suspect that that's what we're going to be feeling next week when the tournament happens. I mean, there's a lot of Eternal to be played between now and then, but that's how I feel in this format. You're going to be squeezed between the two of them, and if you're doing anything reasonable, it's not good enough because these two things are completely unreasonable.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is that, well, for on the aggro side of things, it's that the only good 1-drops in the format are soldiers, and the only good, aggro deck is soldiers, because, if you look at fire 1-drops, there's, Auto Tread, and there's Pyro Knight, and, that's about it as far as fire 1-drops goes. What are you going to take, Badlands Survivalist? That's not a very good card.
I think that card is constantly underrated, but it's still not necessarily good. It's just people think that's completely unplayable, and I don't think that's the case. But anyway,
it's like a D plus and not an F.
I would say it's a C and not an F, but okay. Regardless, it's not a card that you want to play if you can get away with it.
And of course, Auto Tread, while being a very powerful card, is also not always the most aggressive card, right? Because it requires a power investment, and unless you have to play the power investment, it's just a 1/1. It's a very powerful card, and it's probably still also very good in an aggressive deck, but it's not quite the aggressive 1-drop you want. If we had 8 2/1s, or even we had 3 good 1-drops in fire and Auto Tread on top of that, then suddenly Auto Tread probably is kicking pretty hard. But
yeah.
As is, the problem is that the only aggro deck right now is this Soldiers deck. It's a weird format. Would you agree with that sentence? It's just a weird format?
Yeah, well, you can't play fire aggro. It's absolutely ludicrous to try to play fire aggro because you have to deal with Grenahan, which is going to show up in a lot of the decks, and you have to deal with Dovid, which is also going to show up in a lot of decks, and you can't deal with either of those very well. I guess you'd rather see Grenahan out of the two, probably.
We have some really good fire top end in the format, but we don't have any way to get to the fire top end.
Yeah, it is a weird format in that fire aggro I don't think is going to be a reasonable choice at all, and that's going to open it up for all sorts of weird nonsense. Well, I don't know, weird nonsense including Overloader, and meaning that you can't expect to play a long game because you'll just get picked apart by this combo.
So that is our sort of rundown on the current weird state of Expedition as is.
As with for the Throne Open, I will be compiling a deck sheet, which just has a lot of information about the various decks that I expect to be present for this next tournament. And if you didn't see it, it's definitely worth checking out because I think it had a lot of valuable information. I talked about the decks that I expected to see, their strengths, their weaknesses, and compiled it in a Google sheet so that you can take a look at it, get example lists, and know what you're up against. Anyway, so I am making another one of those for this Expedition Open, and last time I had a lot of help from the people in the Friends of Eternal Team League team, and I expect to have a lot of help from them completing this one as well. So link is in the description. You can also see what the Throne one looked like. It's on a different tab in the sheet, but it should all be there. Anyway, I hope that is helpful for folks, because I'm going to end up putting a lot of work into it. Anyway, let's continue.
So to wrap up FECast, I'm going to talk about the dates to remember. So as always, here are the next 3 TNEs. We have one on April 13th, one on April 23rd, and one on April 27th. This is the first one on 13th is Throne, and then the ones on the week of the 20th are Expedition. So we have one last Throne event, and then we're moving back to Expedition. So those Expedition ones will probably have a big impact from whatever happens in this Expedition Open. So the Open itself is just 3 days after the TNE. It is on April 16th to 18th. And, as we've been talking about, it's 1 week from today as of this recording. And Direwolf did an interesting announcement. This is sort of the first time they've ever done this. And it's probably because we got this tournament so far in advance. Direwolf has a date change. Direwolf has moved the Stormbreak Draft Open from where it was before to Friday, April 30th to Sunday, May 2nd. So they've moved it up 1 week or two? So a lot less time to draft, unfortunately. So, I mean, it's cool that we get the drafting sooner, but it's also disappointing that, means that there's going to be less drafters on, the draft ladder for less time. That being said, Direwolf has given us a consolation prize, and that consolation prize is that we got the date of the Throne Open for the summer cycle. It is June 11th to 13th. So there's a whole month gap of Direwolf digital sponsored tournaments for Eternal. And the implication here, I think the idea that most people have when they consider it is that this means that there's going to be a new set in mid-May. So I think there's going to be a set announcement or some spoilers during the draft open. And we'll start getting some spoilers for the next week or two. And we will get a new set 11, a full, big set to fully rotate the formats, both Expedition, Throne, and Draft mid-May. Would you think that's likely, Sunny?
Yeah, I think that's definitely what it looks like it's going here. I'll just say that obviously the date change is unfortunate for anyone that it affects adversely, but I'll take it for knowing roughly when a tournament is going to be. I have to change my work schedule in order to accommodate this, but I'm much happier about this happening than the alternative, the last several years where we just don't know yet. So thank you, Direwolf. Keep giving us dates ahead of time. I am enjoying it. All right, well, that wraps it up for FECast today. I hope that everyone goes out and battles in the Expedition Open and probably has a better idea of what to bring than we do, 7 days out. But hopefully that'll be more apparent as things get closer. As always, we thank our patrons at patreon.com for helping support FECast and making this possible. If you would like to donate to FECast and help pay our editor and help pay for hosting fees, we really appreciate it. So thank you to Odzos, Preweeben, Work Done Son, Chamomile, Chrissier, GDM, and Yeastout for their continued support of FECast. Finally, a big shout out to our editor, SRFS, who puts in unreasonable amount of time in order to make sure that FECast gets out to everyone quickly and with very high quality timestamps and descriptions and links and all that. That is SRFS's work, and we are eternally grateful for it. Thanks again for listening to FECast, and good luck in the Expedition Open if you're playing. Until next time, we will see you in the friend zone. The Friends of Eternal Discord is the best place on the internet to get better at Eternal. We have players of all skill and experience levels, all happy to help each other out on basically any aspect of their Eternal gameplay. And making all this possible is our generous patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support FECast or Friends of Eternal, consider donating at patreon.com/Friends of Eternal. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, we'll see you in the friend zone.